So we're in Genesis 38. This is an interesting kind of, I'll ask you first. What do you guys think? I'm going to need some help tonight. What do you think about this? I know most of you have read this before. Why is this? We got introduced to Joseph. He was sold into slavery. Why is this chapter here before we continue discussing Joseph in Potiphar's house in the next chapter? Any thoughts or ideas? Please, Warren.
Well, it could be that we're giving examples of how someone like Joseph can rise above his surroundings and his environment. Having maybe a father the way he was, brothers the way they were. And to see that still, when God works in our lives, the great results we can have despite what our upbringing might be.
Okay. Any other thoughts on it? Okay, well, I have some thoughts, but I think we're going to keep reading through, and then we'll see how kind of close we all get by the end of the chapter. I like Warren's point, though, that you've got two brothers from the same family with drastically different outcomes. Drastically different outcomes. I'll start reading the first part. And it came about at the time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite, whose name was Horah. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. And he took her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Er. Then she conceived again and bore a son, and named him Onan. She bore still another son, and named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she bore him. Now Judah, well, let me pause there for a moment. How do you think Jacob felt about Judah going and taking a Canaanite wife? Any thoughts? It seemed to be, it was certainly an issue when the Canaanite man had relations with Dinah. It's been an issue in the past. I think what we see here is, as we're moving through this chapter, more and more of the brothers, or there continues to be this intermarrying with the Canaanites. And I think ultimately, man, I'm going to jump ahead now. I think ultimately, maybe this is why God said, I'm not going to have you stay here for 400 years. Rather, I'm going to put you in Egypt where they don't like shepherds, so that you'll grow amongst yourselves and not intermarry with these folks and be given to their false gods. And so I guess that's part of the reasons I suspect that this is lumped in the middle here. That, and we're going to see the continued seed promise from Genesis 12:3. So now Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So that seems more keeping now with the favored son, right? We don't see too many in the at least from my memory. Nathan, Warren, you guys correct me, or anybody else if you can think otherwise. But to this point, a lot of the major players, if you will, in the lineage of Christ have been kind of chosen by dad. Now we see this guy running off and choosing a wife on his own, but then he chooses the wife for his son. Why? Was he not capable of going and getting his own wife? Or did he realize maybe, was there some conversations that happened that, hey dude, you're not doing this right? Now Genesis gives us a very short account here. Yeah.
Well, wasn't it common to have arranged marriages?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Now, which is why I hearken back to oh man, who was, I'm drawing a blank right now. The Ishmaelites. Ishmael, yeah. I'm thinking back to some of these guys that didn't have arranged marriages, but rather went and got married on their own. And so, I wonder if Judah, if this marriage would have happened had Jacob been involved. Matter of fact, at this point, we haven't read that he's married. We don't read that until later. It just says that he had relations with this woman. Anyways, there's a lot, I guess, in the background of these first 6 verses. Because you're right, an arranged marriage would have been the norm. And I love that the Bible presents it as it was, and I think that speaks to its inspiration that God worked with imperfect people. Anyways, continuing on. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went in to his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. I'm really glad we don't have little kids in here tonight. Okay, but when he did what was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, "I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers." So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. So I want to pause there for a moment. For some of you, this might be new information. What's up with the giving of, what's this concept? That this is the first time in Genesis, I think, that we've seen this. What is this act, if you will, of a brother having to marry his brother's wife and give her children? So, actually, I think under Levitical law, there's one exception. But yeah, normally that would not be allowed. And certainly what we're about to see happen in Deuteronomy 25:5, I believe it is absolutely not allowed. And we'll touch back on that. So has anybody heard of this practice, though, before? Go ahead, Warren.
Sometimes it's called the Levirate.
Say it again?
Sometimes it's called the Levirate marriage.
Yeah.
It's in order to keep the inheritance in the family, you need offspring. And in Matthew 22nd chapter, you've got this example there where the Pharisees came to Jesus and they talked about a man or the woman who had all 7 of her brothers as husbands. They were all 7 brothers, and all died without him.
That's right. Who will she be with in heaven?
Whose wife was she going to be with? And that was the issue there. But it goes back to this thing. And then a little bit later we find with Ruth where she went into her husband's relative to try to get this taken. And this was where they spit in her face and they pulled her sandal off and spit in her face.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about Leviticus. I actually have that one written down. Leviticus, I think, is that 18? Maybe not. I was reading that. You know what? I don't think I wrote that one down. I was reading about that, and so what Warren's talking about is later in the law, when the law of Moses was given. That exactly for property, and it also had something to do with a name not being stamped out. If I remember the passage, when Moses gave it, Nathan's shaking his head yes. When Moses gave it, it was, he said, "Hey, the children of Israel, this name shall not be stamped out." And so the brother was required to take this woman and give her at least one child, so that the other brother's line would continue. And then you're right, if they refused to do that, he would take him before the elders, take his sandal off, spit in his face, and he would be known something like by the one who you spit in his face. Basically, it was a huge embarrassment.
One of the unsandaled.
Unsandaled, that's right. And so, I think the money issue, though, is why there would be temptation not to do this. Because if I was to have to, I want to leave everything to my son, Josiah. But then, if I have another son with another woman, he doesn't have my name, but yet I have to give of Josiah's inheritance to to that brother's child that doesn't carry my name?
Well, it's beyond, he's recognized not as your son,
Exactly.
but as the dead brother's son.
But when you, man,
That's why it's such a big deal that Boaz was willing to do that for Ruth.
right, right. Also in the line of, yeah, of Christ, right? Yeah. Which is interesting because you see that, and we see the connection here with we're going to see the connection with Judah's with Judah's twins that he's going to have later in this chapter. But anyhow, so I think it was a money issue though. It was probably a money issue that kept them from doing this the right way then. They're going, well, I think it says almost that. Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So when he went in his brother's wife, he wasted his seed. So that was the crux of the matter. Very interesting. We see a couple things in this chapter. We're going to see some more later. That was the practice over 400 years prior to it being instituted in the law of Moses. So this was a practice that they were apparently doing right. And when you think about it, if she had no kids and she was young enough to have kids, I know this is a drastically different way of thinking than we think today because of the rights that we have in our society and because of the legal protections that we have. But this woman was being provided for by her husband's family. I mean, this was a way of making sure as well that she was well kept. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of things at play right here because because Onan didn't do it either. It says that God also killed him.
Right.
As well. And that's when Judah goes in and tells his next son, or he tells her, remain a widow until my next son is able to, come in. And so something was very significant about this line.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we'll circle back on that. Help me if I forget, please.
I was thinking the same thing, that it provided security for her because having that child is valuable to the line, to the family. And so they're going to take care of her because she has that child. So rather than just, you're gone.
So you can remember this thought. This is something that struck me as interesting when I read this, and we'll read it and we'll together and we'll see it come to fruition. But I thought it was interesting that this Canaanite that Judah went out and chose on his own was not allowed to be in the lineage of Christ. And none of her sons were allowed to be in the lineage of Christ. I just found that interesting that it goes back to Judah. Let's read. Let's see how it comes along. Verse 12. We'll pick it up in. Now, let me ask this first. What were Judah's intentions? When you read verse 11, do you really think Judah's going to make good on this? I don't. I don't think so at all. And I think Tamar must have known that. Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought, I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers. I think he was just scared. He didn't want to lose another kid. Let's keep reading. Now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died, and when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah. He and his friend Harah, the Adulamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat at the gateway of Enim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, Here now, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What will you give me that you may come in to me? He said, therefore, I will send you a young goat from the flock. She said, moreover, will you give me a pledge until you send it? He said, what pledge shall I give you? And she said, your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of her place, where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? But they said, there has been no temple prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. And furthermore, the men of the place said, there has been no temple prostitute here. Then Judah said, let her keep them. Otherwise, we will become a laughing stock. After all, I sent you this young goat, but you did not find her. How times change. This kind of jumped out at me in verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. I think if you go to that same region today, many people will have their face covered. And it's not because they were harlots. You fast forward to the time, just after Christ, where Paul's talking to Corinth, and what was their issue? That people were not wearing head coverings. So, some extra biblical knowledge tells us, and you see this in the passage well in verse 21, temple prostitutes covered their face. And I don't know if maybe, I don't know if Judah didn't know any better, but obviously this Adulamite, who was definitely from the land and perhaps came more out of that religion, he knew that it was temple prostitutes, as is verified by some extra biblical references, covered their face. But times have changed, because now obviously women are treated very differently in these regions who don't cover their face. Anyhow, why would Judah become a laughing stock? Any thoughts on that? I mean, why didn't he go after his stuff? My thought is that he knows he's wrong. One of the things I think that would have continued to happen if they stayed in this foreign land, where a big part of, from the little I've read on these older religions, where a big part of this seems to have to do with prostitution and all sorts of other unhealthy acts, I think the Jews would have gotten more and more involved in this stuff. Clearly, this Adulamite understood that this was a temple prostitute, which means that they were probably all over the place. This was a common occurrence. Judah knew that he is not to be sleeping with prostitutes. And so my opinion is that he didn't want to get caught. He was like, just drop it. Shh. No, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It was something along those lines. I messed up. Nobody back home needs to know about this.
Well, it was also, I thought it was also what he gave her.
His
Because
signet ring, that's kind of important.
What he gave her would be much more valuable to him than a goat. And how foolish would it be to give those things in exchange for what he got?
That's a fair point. I hadn't thought about that.
It's like, what were you thinking? You don't even know what she looks like. You have no idea who she is.
Yeah, it was pretty base action.
There are also things that could identify him.
Right. Absolutely. His cord, his signet ring, yeah, those are pretty personal items. When it said, did it say a signet ring in this? I thought in this version it did.
Seal.
Seal, thank you. haven't studied how seals were used back then, but historically they were used to show, hey, this word or whatever is indeed from so-and-so. This is official. And so, yeah, you wouldn't think that would be something you would want to lose. Yeah. Nathan, you got any thoughts on it before I move on? I see you digging over there.
No, I mean, Katie brought up a good point, is that, he gives it the signet ring and the cord and everything. I mean, yeah, it had work, but it would have tied him too.
Mm-hmm.
And how would that look?
I think that's why he let it go. Yeah, he would be embarrassed. They would know that he had gone out and done something that the Canaanites do, which he should not have been doing. And so clearly he had a knowledge of right and wrong still. He had a knowledge of certain behaviors that were a part of pagan worship they weren't supposed to take part in. And he chose to. All right, let's keep reading. Verse 24. Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. Then Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. I got to stop there for a moment. Why burn? Excuse me. Why burn? Everything I've looked at, I thought like stoning was the norm.
Well, yeah, it's just another form of capital punishment, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is. So we see that one other place in Scripture, actually. And I think it's Leviticus 21, verse 9. I can read my chicken scratch. Yeah, Leviticus chapter 21, verse 9. Also, the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by harlotry, she profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. So, now again, Leviticus, law of Moses. So this is several hundred years later, right? I just thought that was interesting that my understanding was that stoning had been around for a long, long time. I guess burning with fire perhaps could too, but that was reserved, from my reading, for daughters of priests. I think other daughters would have been stoned. So my thought was, is there a reason for the fire reaction to the daughters of priests? Is there a reason for a more severe punishment? I don't know. I think being burnt alive is probably a little more severe than getting knocked out with a stone. It'd be horrible. It'd be painful. It would be stinky. It would send a very clear message to the people who observe this. It would be horrific for Dad. I was just looking at that and I was wondering if there was a correlation. I can't prove that. I was just wondering. What was Judah's job? What was Jacob's job? What was God using them for? He was using them to bless all families on earth. Genesis 12:3. In a way, like the tribe of Israel was later to be, they were to be a light amongst the Gentiles, like the church is today. And I was just kind of going through that in my head a little bit. And I'm going, okay, well, that's why I guess there had to be this burning, this purification, if it came from a priest's family. It was not allowed. And if a son or a daughter of a priest act up, it throws the whole family, including Dad, into question. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing. So was Judah wrong? Or was he just supposed to be being better? Representing the person who had given them this amazing promise. Is clearly, we don't have a ton about the rules and regulations that were given them, but they all knew they were supposed to be following God, And that meant that they should have been distinctly different than the Canaanites around them. And Judah, by choosing to go and marry a Canaanite, muddied his path. Muddied the path of his children. So that's kind of just where my head went. Thoughts? Maybe I went way out in left field on that one. Go ahead, Warren.
Well, this is one of the direct commandments that we find in Leviticus 19. In verse 11 it says, verse 12, a man sleeps with his daughter-in-law, both of them must be put to death. What they've done is a perversion, and their blood will be on their own heads. That's just the exact situation. Of course, this is later.
Right. Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. I had Leviticus 18:15 written down because in Leviticus 18 it talks about it defines what's incest, and a father-in-law sleeping with a daughter-in-law or a son's wife is defined as incest. Yeah. So it's repeated later in Leviticus as well. I think that explains what we're about to read, that Judah slept with her no more. So here, we'll read it a little farther. So he says, because at this point, he doesn't know who she played the harlot with, right? At this point, Judah said, bring her out, verse 24, and let her be burned. Okay, so I'll read to where Warren and I were just talking about. It was verse 25, it was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff these are. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not have relations with her again. It came about, okay, I'll pause there. I have a feeling, and this is again what Warren and I were just, what Warren read in Scripture, and I mentioned a parallel passage about it in Leviticus as well. That was over 400 years later that law was given. But yet Judah, it says, he didn't sleep with her anymore. Jacob was talking with God. These people had some rules. They had some instructions about what was righteous and what wasn't. We don't have it all recorded for us. And I don't think we need to. We have the important stuff when they came out of Egypt. But clearly, there was a reason he didn't go ahead and take her as his wife. There's a reason Scripture records he didn't have relations with her anymore. And I think it goes to God is the same as he was, as he will, forever be. This law hasn't changed much. How they defined incest didn't all of a sudden come about. Is that kind of where you were going, Warren?
Yes.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Very interesting. And I think we get a glimpse in this chapter of a couple of things that are repeated in the law of Moses. So we covered why he didn't sleep with the end. I have to think of a right and a left example of this because I try not to ever talk politics, one-sided politics in a class like this. So, I watch local news, or I watch the news. It's my guilty pleasure. It's like a soap opera. So I watch politics in that vein, and I pray for all of our leaders, regardless of their political affiliation. I was struck recently that CBS and Fox News and the FBI and somebody else, I can't remember who federally, has come out and said, no, this laptop really belonged to Hunter Biden. And then I saw the head, or the guy, Chuck Schumer, who sits on the Intelligence Committee saying, no, it's not. And going all over cable news this week and going, nope. And where you've got really reputable people going, yeah, it is. And I was just thinking about that. And, I'm sure we can think of examples on the right, too. They're eluding me right now, but I know they're there. I had one planned, and I just forgot about it. So my thought was, when I read Judah's reaction, do we see that kind of integrity today in leaders? What was Judah's reaction? He saw these things. I think many of our worldly leaders' reaction today would be, that's not mine. I never did that. But what did Judah do? Yeah. He took his lumps. He was embarrassed. He said, she's more righteous than me. He didn't say she was perfect. He didn't say she didn't sin. He just said, she's more righteous than me. And it takes me to where Jesus, we don't know what he wrote in the sand, when he was dealing with the adulterous woman and the crowd. And he said, whoever's without sin, you cast the first stone. I hope in the church we see that integrity. I hope in our relationships we have that integrity. When we're wrong, where we go, I'm messed up. I'm sorry. I hope we do. And we remember the psalmist who wrote, a broken and contrite heart, O Lord, thou cannot despise. So the old King James came out there. You can't despise that. Why? Because broken and contrite hearts will always turn to God. Broken and contrite hearts are open to correction and to rebuke and to grow and become better. And so I look at Judah and I go, man, he messed up. He slept with his daughter-in-law. He didn't give her what she had coming. He treated her like a second-class citizen. He ignored God's law. She took matters into her own hands, maybe the wrong way, but I think with the right motivations. And at least he handled that right. He didn't deny it. He owned it. And so I give him some credit there. Thoughts about that? Go ahead, Warren.
Well, it goes to motive. And that is, she did not have impure motives. And her motive was to provide for her family, for the future, and for the inheritance that would do her family. If we assume that the law of Moses, which came much later, said the same thing. And also, incest was not defined at this point.
True.
There was no written law, even though Romans 1st chapter tells us that God, from the beginning, mankind knew about these things because of the things that were made. I assume it's a reference to things like this. But we don't have a written law. Now, Judah's motives, what were his motives? Well, they were not pure, that's
Right. Right.
She used an impure way of doing this to accomplish a somewhat noble goal in her mind. He did the exact opposite.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and she ended up claiming what she had a legal right to, from everything we've read. So let's finish this chapter out, and then it'll be about time to bring this to a close. And I appreciate all the conversation, guys. It came about at the time she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it came about as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother came out. Then she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. So Perez, and I read several articles on Perez and Zerah. Sometimes maybe we try and stretch things a little too far. When I read some of the articles on that, the only thing I know for sure is that Perez is in the Davidic line and therefore in the line of Christ. So Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, ended up having relations with this woman that was married to one of his sons, and his son died, and then she is in the lineage in the Gospel of Matthew, in the lineage of Christ. You also will see that Zerah is mentioned in the lineage of Christ. My personal thoughts on that are it's a reference. Matthew was primarily written to a Jewish audience, that it's a reference back to this point, and that it's referencing I just lost her name, goodness gracious. it's referencing the woman because Matthew seems to be more about, if I remember correctly, Mary's lineage. Thoughts on that? And you're shaking your head, Warren, so it sounds like you've dug into this. Yeah, okay. So, redemption burst forth, literally. Perez literally means to create this breach. And so redemption burst forth out of sinfulness. God was amazing. And he had a plan from the very beginning to redeem us out of our sin. So I had a question written down. I already covered it. I'll end with it. Why does God send the Israelites to Egypt? Because really, that's what we're gonna read about now as we continue reading Jacob's genealogy, the 10th Toledoth. We're going to see now it begins to really focus on life in Egypt. I don't think chapter 38 was put here by accident. I don't think it was interposed at some point in the future. It fits perfectly into continuing the messianic promise. It fits perfectly into showing that line at how God was going to preserve and grow the tribe of Israel and preserve the seed promise that was designed to bless all nations and all peoples of the earth in the Christ. That's my take. Guys, thank you so much for your time. And I think we have the devotional now.